Hello there, and welcome to the sixth episode of the Preach with Peach podcast with some very special guests today. I have Dean Abbott. Dean is a writer, a scholar, and a gentleman as well. And today we're going to be talking a lot about some of the more deeper topics that surround love, society, and culture. And I'm really excited to speak with Dean. I've been on his podcast myself, so I already have a previous relationship with him. And he's just a very thoughtful, interesting man. So, Dean, without any further ado, would you like to say hello to the people at home?
Hi, everybody, and thanks for having me here, Jack. It's good to talk to you again.
Yeah, it's good. We were just talking a little bit about, coaching online and helping people, go through their relationship issues or, whether they're single or in relationships. And one of the things that always strikes me is that in our society, it seems like love has probably never been less held at a premium. It seems like love is less valuable than perhaps ever before. But whenever you actually speak to someone, whenever you also read between the lines, often between how people talk about things like love, being single, it seems there is a real still intense longing for that within our society. Like, what do you really think? How do you think this kind of almost dissonance lies between what people say and how they act? This kind of distrust of love, but there's still this longing for it as well.
I think there's obviously a number of dimensions to this, and part of it is I think people just grow up very often with poor attachment in their own early lives, in their families. I'm sure you're familiar with Adam Lane Smith, and the point he's always making is that our culture in particular has kind of made healthy attachment more difficult to achieve. And I think that's correct. And I think we have certainly younger generations, but by no means limited to younger people, a population of people who have basically attachment styles where they are either highly anxious or highly avoidant. And it's interesting too that in terms of the cultural approval, I think we really see the avoidant style of attachment is actually held up as a cultural touchstone for how things should be. And I think too that I think feminism, liberal feminism in particular, has had a big effect here, insofar as liberal feminism for a long time promoted the idea that men could, for example, have sex without love. Okay. Now, obviously, that is a great generalization, and there may be a kernel of truth to it, but it leaves out a lot of men's experience. The solution to that problem proposed by liberal feminism was to essentially encourage women to be like men. Or not even to be like men, but to be like this stereotype of men. And so what you have is you have generations of women now who have been trying to live out, or have been taught that the proper way to live is to live in a way that imitates this stereotype. And what is at the core of that stereotype is aloofness, an independence, particularly from love. I've said many times on Twitter, for example, that we really live in an anti-love culture, because this is so much at the core of our sort of highly individualistic arrangement of society. And you see it now, the phrase, believe it or not, I'm not necessarily the hippest guy, right? I'm not necessarily I would not say I have my finger on the pulse of youth culture, to say the least. Excuse me, but I do know this phrase, catching feelings. I'm sure you've heard that. People don't want to catch feelings. Well, even to use that phrase is an indicator of how pervasive, screwed up, avoidant attachment styles and relationship styles are. And so, pretty much, you have this cultural norm which says the right way to approach relationships are that they are transient, in that we shouldn't expect that they would last. They are transactional, in that you are there to get something from this other person, and that other person is only there to get something from you. And three, that they are material, in the sense that there are no transcendent values, there's no soul, there's no spirit. You're basically just bodies who are looking for an exchange. And let me veer off here for just a second on that too. That exchange is dominated by our sort of our market philosophy, right? So when you go, let's say you go to the farmer's market and you've got $1 and you want to buy as many eggs as you want to buy as many eggs for that dollar as you can. And then you have the egg farmer who wants to sell you as few eggs for that dollar as you will accept. Okay. Well, that is the basic philosophy that we see imported into relationships across our culture now, right? Is that it's transactional and I'm trying to get the most from you while giving the least you will accept. And because that has become the cultural norm, what happens is that the deeper desire, which is for love, for intimacy, for permanence, for meaning, right? Meaning that we encounter in our relationships with others. Or in short, love has been shamed. And so we end up with a generation of people who think that catching feelings is the equivalent of getting a disease. I mean, the language betrays that we see loving another person, wanting to be with another person, being attached to another person, craving union with that person. We see that as fundamentally a defect or a disease. And maybe that's the best metaphor, that we are uneasy with that. We see it as dis-ease, to be in that position, because culturally, to love another person is at this point is seen as being dysfunctional. It's seen as being sick. It's seen as being weak, and you caught those feelings, as opposed to seeing that that those feelings, the attachment, the love, the desires for union, permanence, and meaning, that those are an inherent part of the whole thing that you're searching for by having relationships in the first place. And so our culturally, we're just backward, upside down. And so the reality is that millions of people suffer needlessly because they adhere to that kind of cultural script, and that causes them all kinds of problems, as they are in fact always running from their own true desires, which of course they can't outrun because you bring them with you.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned this, because I had a call recently with with a consultation, not a full coaching program, but a consultation with a guy. And he basically wanted reassurance that it was okay that he liked this woman. Like, is it okay that I want to like settle down and just, you know, have kids? Does that make me normal? And I was just like, man, is it's got that bad that this natural instinct within both men and women? I know a lot of people like to say men and, you know, naturally sexually promiscuous. And I think there is an element of truth to that. But like, men also have this desire to settle down and to start something that's more meaningful, something that's deeper and more long lasting. And this guy, I mean, he was in his 30s and he was like, you know, is there something wrong with me for having this feeling? Because culture has told him for so long that you should be the guy out there just sleeping around, you know, sowing your seed where it may, and like, this is what's supposed to be fun. And often for these guys, it can be fun for, you know, 6 months, a year, maybe even sometimes 3 or 4 years. But at some point, kind of this reality sets in where they realize that there is more meaning to life than just, you know, physical pleasure. And one of the things you also mentioned there, which I think is very, very interesting, is how we have this kind of almost upside down view to culture and life and love. And that's something that I've become really, really interested in, because it's really, really interesting how language is often used as like, language is magic. You know, language is the symbols through which we interface with the world. The choice of language we use, the choice of language which is used on us, really changes the way we interpret things around us. And when you mention things like, like catching feelings, right? Another one you'll often see nowadays is in reference to pregnancy, and like a child inside a mother is a parasite because it lives within the host. And all these shifts in language, and as I say, I'm very intrigued by the use of the word upside down, is it almost seems like a demonic inversion within our culture to me. Like, these things are all beautiful experiences. You know, my wife is 7 months pregnant at the moment. It's you know, it's a tough experience. It's a different experience, but it's a beautiful thing that doesn't happen that often in your life. You know, and at the end of it, you get this new life in the world. And it's
one more person to love.
Yeah, exactly. To share that love out, to spread that love, and to bring more of it to you as well, because it's reciprocated, of course. So yeah, I just think it's very interesting when we hear about words like catching feelings. But I also think it's interesting, sometimes you will hear kind of subtle clues where people aren't quite realizing they're doing the same thing. And I made a little short video about this recently. One of these things that I always hear is, you know, you hear people talk about like a body count. You know, how many sexual partners they've had is a body count. And that's actually the same things happening. That's you on an intrinsic level understanding that having sex, with casual sex with many partners, is an unhealthy behavior, because the only other things we associate with body counts are murderers, serial killers. These are the things that we associate with a body count. It's when you literally kill people. And there is still this innate goodness within people that comes out through their own language, but also causes that dissonance I was talking about before. Because there is always
I don't know. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I'm sorry. I don't know if you're familiar with Louise Perry. You know, she has this new book out, Questioning the Sexual Revolution. And I have not yet read her book, but I have heard her interviewed. And one of the points she makes is that the sexual revolution, especially for women, has required the suppression of their fundamental instinct about the specialness of sex, and that in order to essentially live in this upside downish culture, I think it is true for women and for men too, that we have had to suppress not just our instinct that sex is special, but we have essentially had to suppress all of our fundamental human instincts. So part of the important thing to say is that to live in an anti-love culture is fundamentally to live in an anti-human culture. And that our culture is driving us all toward while our culture, the architects of our culture want to talk about liberation, what's actually happening is that the scope of our humanity is being constrained, right? Because it's no longer are your sort of natural human instincts toward family, etc. No longer are those, like I said, unshamed and accepted as normal, just like in the anecdote you just gave, right? The guy who doesn't know if it's normal for him to love a woman and want to be married. And so that's a great example of constriction of our options. We are being constricted under the guise of liberation because we're in this position where we have to suppress all those natural instincts toward family, etc. And I want to just bring up two tweets that I've written in the last year or so that came to mind that I think where I've touched on this point. One of them, and this was, I have been on Twitter a little bit critical of the red pill movement, and we can talk about why later. But one of the, if you want to, one of the tweets that I wrote was simply to say, contrary to a lot of red pill advice, it is in fact perfectly okay for a man to be head over heels in love with a woman. And if people listening to this, if there's anything they take away, I really do think that for many people, one of the most important things they could take away from our talk together is just permission to want to be in love, want to love another person, and want to be loved, to be known. And that it is perfectly okay to want relationships that are more than transactional, material, and transient. You have my permission to want that. The other tweet you brought to mind was I made this point a while back saying our culture teaches us, if you listen closely, that all of our real instincts are toward anything base, right? The desire for sexual promiscuity, whatever. Those are real instincts. But any desire that for anything higher or noble, any impulse we feel toward commitment or toward beauty or toward transcendence, those are not real. Somehow those impulses are not real, not inherent to us or whatever. And so I remember in graduate school essentially being told that, right? That that the real you is, this impulse toward whatever is base and essentially does not work to create an emotionally fulfilling life. That's the real you.
Yeah, I mean, it's the stripping of divinity from man, essentially. It is the
right.
despiritualization, de-religiousization of man, and
the
stripping away,
desacralization
and stripping of man just to an animal. This is something that people I'd always hear growing up. I grew up secular, that humans are just another animal. We're just another animal. Therefore, just like all the other animals, we don't create art. We don't create architecture. We don't do things for a higher purpose. And you only need to look into any basic human history, even prehistory. If you look to tribal groups, the divine is always there. There's always meaning, there's always depth, there's always bonds, there's always love. Like marriage is not, as well, just to move back onto the topic of relationships, marriage and love, is marriage is not a new invention. If you go and look at a prehistoric tribe, yes, some of the conventions within marriage may be different, surrounding divorce or, you know, polygamy, things like that.
Right.
But marriage is always there. You know, there's always this love between the man and a husband. You know, some of the norms around it do differ from situation, but it's always there, and that's because it is instinctive within us. There's no denying it. I wrote a tweet many years ago. It's always been one of my favorite tweets, and it's about, you know, birth, death, and marriage. They're the three things that all human cultures ritualize, right? It's because love, new life, and the ending of life will always hold special meaning. They are deep, deeply rooted within our psyche, and we do, by desacralizing them, taking it away from that divine nature, we take away a lot of our soul and what it means to be human by doing that. And we do strip away and make our culture less beautiful, but also less fulfilling as well.
Right.
I want to kind of change the tack a little bit and kind of on a similar line, because we were talking before a little bit about attachment issues. You talked about Adam, and also how these kind of avoidant or anxious patterns of behavior can stop people from having committed relationships. And a lot of that, in my experience of coaching anyway, comes down to actual these kind of base instincts and kind of defense mechanisms that people have, where they have suffered something, or they've been hurt in childhood, or whatever it might be, or in a previous relationship. And they actually create these instinctive patterns which stop them from being able to find love. It's an unconscious pattern of behavior that they're not aware of. And I'm curious as well, like on your perspective, how do you think that kind of fits in with the overall picture of what a relationship looks like in terms of this baseness? When we're hurt, we respond to these base instincts, which then separate us from being able to have these deeper connections. And like, for me, it's a very interesting paradox. You know, it's like this this cyclical nature is, as we become more base, we become less able to actually have these deeper connections. So I'm just kind of interested to hear your thoughts on that, and where you really want to take that question.
Yeah. Let me make sure I kind of understand what you're saying. I think what you're asking is, you know, as society has essentially devolved, right? What we see the normalization of every kind of dysfunctional behavior. And so what then happens is that because all of those kinds of things, all this unhealthy behavior is normalized. And it's interesting too, like we get so many cultural double messages about all kinds of behaviors that really don't lead to stable relationships, right? Because they're often portrayed as good in and of themselves, while also portrayed as with a kind of veneer of questionableness, right? But everyone really knows what the cultural norm and expectation is, and that is behaviors that lead to instability in relationship, dishonesty, lack of self-control, an inability to express oneself articulately. You talked about language. Many years ago, I was a university professor, and I had a student come in, um, probably a second year student, probably 19 or 20, and I had assigned a book that was written at an 8th grade reading level, and he just said, "I can't read this book." And I said, "What do you mean you can't read it?" Like, I literally thought he didn't have the book. He said, "No, no, I have the book. I literally cannot read this book. I can't understand what he's saying." And I think that, like you were saying, language is the power that builds relationships. And so when you have an increasingly inarticulate and essentially illiterate culture, that has an impact on the quality of relationships that people can build. So uh, I think you're asking about that, about the cultural devolution and how that impacts relationships. Is that right?
Yeah, we can go into that. Yeah. My point was more that, like, it's a funny kind of cycle that as people get hurt within relationships, right?
Okay.
They create defense mechanisms which then stop them from, well, cause them more hurt, essentially.
Yeah.
And
So yeah. I'm sorry. Sorry, talk
it's
over.
all good.
So this is where I was going with that. So what has essentially happened is that we have become, in many ways, a more emotionally dangerous society. And what you get is you get people who come up in this more emotionally dangerous society who, before they even think about developing any kind of serious relationship, are already armored over with defense mechanisms. Now, of course, all people in all ages have had psychological defense mechanisms, but what cultures can do is to provide countervailing and balancing forces in the culture. For example, in education. So if you have an education the way many Americans did in the early, up through the middle of the 20th century, that emphasizes things like self-control, respect, loyalty, etc., and emphasizes these kind of general values, that's a countervailing force that operates and sort of draws people out of their defended positions. So in our culture, what we have is an emotionally dangerous culture where all of those countervailing forces have been removed. And so people just emerge into the culture in a kind of devastated state, but still hungry for love. And yes, so you're right. As that happens, they become less capable of making the kind of connection they're looking for. But as they try to make that connection, they end up becoming like a vector of pain for the people they're connecting with, which puts people in this like terrible cycle of, anguish where they spiral, up or down, depending on what metaphor you want to use, but they spiral into increasing levels of pain that then can probably only be resolved for them essentially through apathy. And so you get to that kind of, well, I don't care, I don't want to catch feelings kind of attitude, which is born out of both sort of what I was calling the emotionally dangerous environment of our culture generally, and lots of experiences trying to connect, trying to find love, and having that only be a source of frustration because they can't get beyond their defense mechanisms.
Yeah, I one of the things I picked up on there is something that's a real theme in one of my books, Weaponized Sex, which is the interplay between biology and culture, right? Like, which is, we have these, there's no doubt that humans can descend into suboptimal actions, to say the least. It's, I think, probably our natural state, but we do have the power to moderate this through culture. And I think it's really important to understand how culture has stripped back those defense mechanisms, like those not defense mechanisms, just don't want to mix language, but those ways of moderating and keeping people healthy, right? And keeping society healthy.
What I was calling countervailing forces.
Right? Yes. Yeah. Right. And that stripping away has done all kinds of second order effects. You mentioned the sexual revolution before. I think it's at the heart of it. But even I think a lot of this actually stems from the end of the 2 world wars, where Western nations, there's so much trauma and pain that shot out from the death and, you know, the PTSD that people would have gone through, that has actually rippled through our culture and led, I think, to the sexual revolution as well. And there's a lot of healing that needs to be done now. And I think we are at a point where people are aware of this. It's becoming, you know, I don't want to leave us all on a black pill doom kind of everything's terrible situation. There are people, you know, like Dean, who are helping people to be able to actually get through these patterns and stop these cycles. And it's worth remembering that you can stop these cycles. So in terms of people who maybe are going through this kind of situation, maybe they're struggling to be able to actually get over their defense mechanisms, really reach out and begin to love people, what would you recommend for these kind of people? How would you recommend them to start to try and overcome that issue?
Well, I think 2 or 3 things. I think the first step to these things is always awareness. And we are born, everyone is born asleep, right? We're born not having that critical distance on ourself, on our surroundings, on our culture, that some of us develop. Many people never develop it. But if you want to overcome any kind of sort of inward pattern that limits you, waking up to its effects and its origins is always helpful. And the way that you do that, I think one way is simply education. And I think that the power of education to expand consciousness is something that I don't hear talked about much, but it is a really important thing. So, for example, I would hope that there might be people listening to this very podcast who whose thought might be sparked, whose awareness might be increased just from hearing us chat about these things. So, as a part of the essential freedom of a human being is the ability to direct your own growth, right? No plant or animal has that other than the human being. It's part of what I was saying earlier about the divine part of being human, is that we are able at some level to superintend our own growth. And taking responsibility to do that is a huge part of overcoming and outgrowing those negative patterns that hold you back. So I think the first thing you have to do is seek awareness by asking yourself questions and educating yourself on, for example, attachment styles. How are men and women different? What makes a relationship work? So those kinds of education things are important. Taking responsibility to become a growth-oriented person is huge. And it's something that essentially few people do. You know, I'm 52 years old, and I've been around long enough to see that most people simply settle into those patterns and stick there. if you don't want to be that kind of person, the option is to really put your own psychological, spiritual, relational, emotional growth as your first priority. And then once that is a kind of arranged the way it should be, lots of the actions will fall out of that. Okay. So you're educating yourself about topics that are relevant. That's the first thing. Take responsibility to become a growth oriented person. And third is, I think there must be self examination, another skill which most people don't have. And that's why I'm perpetually recommending to people silence, some sort of prayer or meditative practice where they have space to actually allow all of those things which they've been suppressing to arise, and to be able to do that in a place and in a way and in a process that allows those things to come up, allows those fears that you've been suppressing into your unconscious to become conscious, so that you can then make a choice about whether or not you're going to continue to live that pattern out. And so without some kind of practice of silence, prayer, meditation, even journaling, without some self-reflective practice, it's very hard to allow those things to happen for you. And the fourth thing I would say is conversation.
Mhm.
I think whether that's, working with a coach, whether that's working with a therapist, even if it's a pastor, a member of the clergy, whatever, I do think that it is probably necessary for there to be some level of interchange with another trusted person who himself has has made a commitment to being a growth oriented person, and who has outgrown some of the patterns that you are trying to outgrow.
Yes.
And so I think those would be my four recommendations: educating oneself, taking responsibility for being growth oriented, practicing having some kind of personal practice of self reflection, and making it a discipline to have honest conversation with others who might mentor you through those things.
Yeah.
And I think people who consistently practice that can't help but see improved results.
Absolutely. As long as the information they're getting is good, because
Sure.
there is some information out there which is not so good. And one thing you mentioned as well there, which is, you mentioned before, the red pill, for example, that can be one of the ways that people believe they're educating themselves on relationships and men and women, right, and it can actually end up having the opposite effect because it's a twisted representation. But one thing you mentioned there as well is that the person that you enjoy the conversation aspect, which I think is the hardest part for a lot of men, is to actually come up and actually decide, okay, actually, I do want to get some help. I do want to talk to someone about this, because there is this implicit feeling of failure within a man when he cannot succeed with relationships in particular. There's something so intrinsic about men and women, and the way that it's presented in culture doesn't help, that when men don't have that success, they feel like failures at a core level that I don't think many other areas of failure will elicit. Maybe work is one of the few others. And it's worth remembering you have to be able to trust these people that you do decide to share with, because whenever you open up and you talk about these things, it is intensely vulnerable. You're going to be sharing aspects of yourself you don't share with with most other people. So make sure you're doing it with the right people, and be very careful with who you do, because a lot of these, from my experience of coaching, a lot of these defense mechanisms can come up often because people have misjudged who to be vulnerable with and who to share with. and they've not been discerning enough, or they weren't old enough to understand it. And it can even be mild cases. Like, one of the things that I think is really terrible about public schools is, I think the way that public schools work, when emotionally immature people are thrust together and have to spend all day together with 30 emotionally immature children in one room, is that sometimes kids who are more vulnerable, more open than others, will express that openness with a kid who doesn't have the emotional maturity to know how to deal with that, and they shut them down and they hurt them. And that, when that happens repeatedly at public school, that can really cause a kid to close down and not feel comfortable sharing with people. So you have to be really discerning about it, but it is really, really important to be able to do it. To be able to actually accept and understand that wanting to get help in these things doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make you emasculate.
Absolutely.
Men have always sat around the campfire and talked about these things. You know, fathers historically have always sat down with their sons and told them about the intricacies of the heart, about women, small things. Like, I distinctly remember my dad sitting down and telling me when I was a kid, you know, one thing women want more than anything else is a woman that listens to them. If you can listen to a woman, you'll stand out from most men. I remember my dad telling me that when I was like 13 or something. And it's been something that stuck with me. And, you know, I've never particularly had a problem with women, because I was lucky enough to have that kind of mentorship role with my father. Not every man not every man has a father these days. Not every man has that relationship with their father. But it's really, which is part of the problem. Exactly. It's really important you try and seek these guys out. That, again, as Dean mentioned, also people who have come through these kind of situations as well, because that's something that there's a level of maturity to someone who's been through crisis or come through challenges as well, which will infuse the way that they talk with you, the way that they understand what you're saying. So yeah, I just second what you said, basically.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right.
And one thing as well that I know you've talked about before, and one thing that I think we might have maybe not a subtly different opinion on. I think there might be a different flavor that we have. And one thing you've talked about with me is the importance within relationships, if you're in a relationship, of over communicating. Now, communication is always important within a relationship. The way that you communicate is really important. Something I focus on heavily with my clients, because a lot of men are bad at communicating with women these days. And you've mentioned, why over communicating is so important. So I'm just curious about you. Why do you think over communication is such a key within a relationship?
Well, when I say over communication, what I mean is that I found it generally helpful to always assume that I don't fully understand the other person, especially when there's an emotional issue coming up. And so I think it's good to encourage your partner to over communicate, right? By assuming that you don't understand. Tell me more about that, especially if you're a man, because saying, tell me more about that, tell me more about where you're coming from, help me understand. These are all signals that you're listening, right? Just like your dad said. Right. And so I think that we often make the assumption that we are clearer in our communication than we are, and that we are not necessarily communicating through layers of assumption and experience that the other person brings to that. And so, I mean, I don't necessarily mean by over communication like text every 2 minutes, but I do mean assume that language and understanding is not a given, right? The understanding is not a given. And that even on mundane things, right? Like, who is going to go get the milk? that's in a day-to-day relationship, that is the kind of thing that gets easily misunderstood. And enough of those misunderstandings have an emotional impact. And so as a general rule, I think over communicating is useful, even if it's just checking in. Hey, we said I was going to get the milk, right? Yes, we said, okay, so you just check that again. I just find that it's generally useful for avoiding sort of the bumps of daily life. And also when there are more significant and emotional issues come up, assuming that you don't understand the other person's position fully and inviting that person to say more about what they're experiencing. Both those kinds of over communication, I think, are extremely helpful in relational situations for those reasons.
Yeah, I think it comes down to clarity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you're absolutely right. Often there will be so much of communication as well is not just what you're saying, right? There's more often, and particularly for women, right? Women are very adept at picking up on it and also using it more. They're less direct than men as a result. And sometimes, yeah, as a man, people often like to talk about leadership as a man. You have to lead the relationship. But nobody ever talks about what that really means. This is one of my bugbears, right. And men are going to lead the relationship. Okay, what does that actually mean, right? One of the ways that you lead the relationship is through communication. Like, it's through starting conversations. It's through, as Dean says, they're clarifying certain things, making sure that you're going to be the person who, hey, is this exactly what you mean? Is this exactly what I think you mean? Is that actually what you mean? And sometimes the way that all you have to do to lead a relationship is just, like you say, check in. Just figure it out. Like, okay, is this actually what we need to do? Like, actually, there's a problem I noticed here. Like, I sense you're a little bit tense for whatever reason. Like, why is that? Like, what's actually caused that? Because sometimes we do things unconsciously as men. We don't understand upset women, right? And vice versa, by the way. We'll sometimes do these things, and guys will pick up on the cue. They'll pick up on the fact that she's feeling a little bit annoyed, she's feeling a little bit frustrated. But then the way that you actually lead in that situation is to figure out why.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And actually take that cue and respond to it in a way that's mature. It's not in a way that's like, oh, she's annoyed, I'm just going to avoid her. Right. She's annoyed, I'm just like, she's annoyed again. Oh, like, what can I do about it? Right. Like,
I think, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's really just, that's the point. It's just really important to be able to actually get in and talk. And I think one of the reasons this is why I didn't say we'd have a fundamental disagreement. I wanted to hear you elaborate more, because there might be a subtle disagreement, but it might just be, again, in the language, right? Over communication. It sounds like something.
Exactly,
Which I thought, maybe I'll have a little, a slightly different nuanced take to Dean on this. But then when you actually explain it, we're actually coming from the same position, actually, in the way that we view these things. So this is actually an example of, even within men, that are in general more direct in their communications, are generally easier to understand, because we're coming from the same kind of foundational lens.
I think so. One thing I'd say, I've been thinking a lot lately about that question of what leadership means in a relationship. And I'll throw this out there. This is my provisional definition of what it could, because like you said, people don't break it down. And especially like sort of traditionally minded guys can easily think that what it means to be the leader is that they should get their way. Right.
Yeah, which is absolutely not the case.
But I would say, I think my provisional definition for this is that to be the leader means to be the one who is initiatory, I guess, all toward her flourishing, so that you are always thinking, what's the next thing that needs to happen for her to basically become all that she could be? And that as the leader, you are seeking the fulfillment of everyone you're leading.
Yeah.
And one of we're getting off the topic here a little bit, but one of the things that comes up again and again on Twitter for me when I write about these things is I have guys who write in and who respond or send me a DM or whatever, who are angry that that's not fair, right? It's not fair in their book that they should have to look out for her flourishing. And I'm not saying women also have to look out for men's flourishing. I'm not, they're upset that it's not fair. But what I want to say to that is that, a healthy relationship, a healthy marriage, whatever, is a symbiotic relationship. And that as he leads toward her flourishing, what he gets out of that is meaning, right? He finds a fulfillment in her fulfillment, right? That he cannot have on his own if he's properly oriented toward his role and his duty. He will see her flourishing as his own fulfillment in a way, right? And without seeing that, it just becomes this thing of like, well, it should be fair, and if you want to, if you want to be a man who is in a successful relationship with a woman, the first thing you have to do is give up your expectation that it will be fair.
Yeah.
Right.
What does fair even mean, right? Like in this context,
right?
Of a relationship.
Fair in the sense of like, we will each have the same role toward the other.
Yeah. So what they want is equality within a relationship. Right. So they've essentially, like, guys who want this have entered the feminist mentality.
Frame.
Yes. Frame. They want equality within a relationship. Like, you cannot be the leader without having more responsibility.
Right.
It's that simple, guys. Like, if you want to be a leader, you want the burden of leadership, because leadership is a burden. People believe that it's all fun and games and it's everyone gives you the applause and you did great, look where we led. No, being a leader is the person, if you're in a business, it's the person who decides who gets fired. You want that burden, on your shoulders, that responsibility. It's a weight. Within a relationship, it's the same. You're the one who has to decide, okay, we've got to go a certain way. And if that doesn't work out, by the way, I've got to live with the consequences of that.
Right.
It's about saying, okay, like, I've got to make sure that the people who are dependent on me, which is to a degree, obviously not like fully dependent, but your wife and your children are dependent on you. That means you have to get up and you have to be working hard. You have to be aware of their moods. You have to be the one who's leading them through those. I assume that's what you mean by her flourishes, right? You mean like her mood?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's part of it, but also in terms of her, developing her skills, developing her interests, and just, making sure that she's able as much as possible in this life to realize her potential, as much as circumstances will allow.
And I think a lot of these guys, they just actually want all the benefits of a relationship with none of the sacrifices, because there are sacrifices and there are difficulties and there are struggles. And yeah, you get great benefits. You get someone to take care of you, to talk, to share with, to share your heart, who understands you. You get regular sex in a way that single men don't get. You get all these benefits that come with it, but there are responsibilities. There are burdens that come with this, and you can't just expect to get the good stuff with none of the bad stuff. Or when, the difficulties come, or the challenges come in managing and being able to create a healthy dynamic for you both, which at times is going to require you to get ahead of the curve and be aware of what's going on. Yeah, that's difficult. But again, like anything in life that's worth having, there's an element of challenge that comes with it.
Sure. Right. Okay.
All right, Dean, on that point, I know it's quite late where you are, and
yes, I'm getting sleepy.
Yes, we all have busy lives. I just want to say thank you very much for making the time to be here. It's really great to speak with you again.
Yeah, we should do it again.
Yeah, we'll do it again at some point in the future and just have a check-in, and hopefully the people at home will have enjoyed this conversation. And if they want to follow you, get on your newsletter, all that stuff, where can they find you? And send me a link as well, and I'll link it.
I will. Yeah, the easiest thing to do at this point is just to go to Dean Abbott, DeanAbbott.substack.com. The about page there has lots of information about me and what I'm doing. And you could also find a link to my Twitter from there, where I'm usually active every day on Twitter. And you can subscribe to my newsletter through Substack and get in touch that way.
Awesome. So yeah, it's been great to speak with Dean. And for everyone else, I will link below my free guide to approaching women if you want to download that to help improve your interactions with women, and hopefully get to meet more women and get into the situation where you can get into a relationship. We've talked a lot more about the deeper levels of relationships in this podcast than in some others. But for now, I want to say thank you very much, guys. Thank you very much, Dean. And I will see you in the next one. Jack out.